said, this is Mike Albu from the Beam Exchange. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Beam-hosted webinar on market systems and job quality. Still a couple of people joining late, but I think we should crack on now. Thanks for your patience in waiting for us to begin. So today's event is the latest in an ongoing series of Grab the Mic webinars that Beam Exchange arranges. We do that in order to encourage knowledge exchange and learning amongst market systems development practitioners. So welcome to you all. I was going to start by reflecting on the recent review we published of the synthesis of the evidence available about the impact of market systems approaches. Beam published this a few weeks, and it does for the first time provide strong evidence that the market systems approach is a valid way of promoting economic development and reducing poverty. However, I was talking to Steve Hartrich about this recently, and while this is encouraging, it is also true that our understanding of how market systems programs can benefit the poor is a long way from being complete. And in particular, for many development agencies have objectives around creating more and better jobs. And our understanding of how market systems approach can better address employment challenges, particularly job quality, has been limited so far. So, to address this, today's speakers are going to talk about the research that they've been doing about looking into what we already know about this and how we can use our collective knowledge to design and implement programs that better address employment. So to introduce the speakers and moderate this webinar, I'm very pleased to introduce Steve Hartrich from ILO.
Yeah, many thanks for the introduction, Mike, and thanks to the Beam Exchange and DCAD for giving us the opportunity to present on some research that we've sponsored on market systems and job quality. So yeah, I would maybe just introduce the speakers first of all here. So yeah, Raksha Vasudevan and Ben Fowler from Marketshare Associates will be talking through some research that they did for us on examining 18 market systems development and private sector development projects and sort of trying to find out what the learnings were for the practitioner and donor community about how we can better address working conditions in market systems programs. And one of the cases they examined was actually BIF Myanmar, which Sebastien Moineau will provide I guess an example case on how to address working conditions using the market systems approach in the government sector there. So before we get into presenting too much, I'll just sort of give you an overview on the day or on the webinar here, and we'll be looking to present for about 30 minutes, and we will take questions at the end. We should have about 25 minutes for questions, and when you have a question, as you go along during the presentation, please do put it into the chat box, which you'll find on the right-hand side of the webinar, or the WebEx software. So if I maybe jump in where we sort of, why we're here, why we sponsored this research. And the lab, the project that I work for, is a global initiative which is focused on generating knowledge on how the market systems approach can address decent work. Now, we do this through collaborating with field projects, conducting research, all with the sort of interest of developing real practical guidance that can help practitioners grapple with the issues that they have in addressing decent work. Through our sort of research in the last 3.5 years, we've developed flagship publications, brief studies, and gamification of concepts on looking at sector selection, market analysis, intervention design, implementation, market facilitation and measurement, all with a lens of trying to address decent work. We're sponsored by the Swiss, and we have SECO, and we have another 3 years of sort of providing this information for you guys. So that sort of sets the context, and if we think about why we wanted to fund this research, we've got 3.5 years under our belt, and we sort of wanted to figure out what we've learned so far. And I think what we've learned so far is that we have a lot of work done on agriculture sectors. If we look at ITAD's examination of market systems development projects, which Mike referred to in the introduction, we have over 60% of the market systems projects are focused on agriculture. And that's great because a lot of these programs are really focused on generating impact for the poor, the ones that need it. When we're thinking about job quality, we often find that projects focused on agriculture are focused on smallholder farmers, and the decent work deficits that they address are often income, because that's what smallholder farmers are most focused on. We know a lot less about what's happening in other sectors, particularly non-ag sectors off the farm in service or manufacturing, and that's where decent work deficits are a little bit more complicated to address, measure, report on. We take these three pictures at the bottom here. We've got maybe the decent work deficit for these gentlemen on the bottom left is more about sort of getting a stable contract. Those in the middle, maybe it's more about social dialogue or not working excessive overtime hours. And for the construction worker on the right, maybe it's about having proper safety equipment or better occupational safety and health. So decent work is not so simple, and in these particular sectors are off the farm, it's really not too simple to address. At the same time, in the background, we have rapid urbanization and a demand for more off the farm work. I saw a statistic last week which said that by 2050 we'll have 2.5 billion more people in urban environments, and of that 90% will be in Africa and Asia, which is commonly where our market systems programs are working. So we'll see more demand for work, but also I feel like anecdotally we're seeing more programs shift into the urban or non-farm space. At the same time, we have practitioners that are sort of craving evidence and want to, there's lots of excitement about market systems and decent work, but they really want to know how to address it, or even if it has impact, and maybe there's some growing skepticism. So with that all in the backdrop, we wanted to commission some research to really tell us what do we know about market systems and job quality. Can market systems projects generate impacts that improve working conditions? And if so, what can we do about it as donors and practitioners? So with that, I will turn over to our researchers, Ben and Raksha from Marketshare, who will talk you through what they found in trying to answer some of those questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. So as he mentioned, my name is Ben Fowler, and I'm here with Raksha Vasudevan from Marketshare Associates. And we're going to share a little bit of the highlights from the research that we conducted, funded by the lab. There's a quote that we found really interesting as we went through this research, and it said, "It is not necessarily that the poorest people are excluded from labor markets, but rather that they are adversely included." And one of the things that we certainly have found in our own work in market systems programming is an overwhelming focus on job creation. How can we create more jobs for the people that we're targeting? We've seen a lot less focus on job quality and on working conditions. And yet, as Steve mentioned, there's increasing recognition that actually, in many cases, the working conditions that people are experiencing are some of the key barriers to their improvement in their quality of life. So first off, we had to start by deciding, well, what is job quality? And we ended up using a framework that the ILO developed, which includes 7 different aspects of quality employment. It includes things that we more commonly think of when we think of job quality, such as income levels or benefits or safe working conditions, but also some less frequently considered aspects like social dialogue and workplace relationships.
Great. So picking up from that, we had 2 main objectives when we started off this research. And the first was to understand which of these 7 aspects of job quality that you just saw have been addressed through a market systems development approach, what the impacts have been and how this has been achieved, as well as to identify key knowledge gaps and potential areas for further research and action. And in order to do this, we identified over 100 market systems development projects, out of which a total of 18 were selected for further review and inclusion in the study. And we selected these 18 using the 3 criteria that you see up on the screen. So first, as I mentioned, they had to apply the principles of a market systems approach, even if they used different terminology to refer to their own approach. We prioritized the ones that focused on working conditions beyond job creation and income improvement for reasons that my colleagues just mentioned. And we also focused on ones that were working in diverse sectors outside of agriculture and as well outside of access to finance. And what we found was, in spite of our efforts to generate balanced evidence across all 7 working conditions, most of the programs we studied still focused on working condition number 2, which is income and benefits, which includes job creation. And there were a few reasons for this that my colleagues have already mentioned, so I won't go into. A couple of other job quality aspects that market systems programs often tried to address, we found were working condition number 1, safety and ethics of employment, especially safety at work and improving access to jobs for groups such as women and youth, as well as condition number 6, skills development and training, which was a common part of workforce development programs that took a market systems approach, as well as working condition number 3, working time and work-life balance. And this was especially common in programs that had a strong women's empowerment focus. And those were sort of the top 3 that were addressed, and the remaining 4, even among our selected sample, were much less commonly addressed. So with that in mind, what can we say about the impacts? Well, what we found was the available evidence suggests that the impacts have been largely positive across the 7 aspects. However, the majority of the evidence collected has been rather weak in the sense that it's been mostly anecdotal when it was collected at all, or did not show a clear link between changes in job quality and programming, and unintended impacts, especially like job displacement and post-project impacts, were rarely known. And this is illustrated in the evidence heat map that you see up on the screen. And the darker the blue, the higher the rigor of available evidence. And as you can see, most of the evidence collected, especially for the less complicated aspects of job quality, is lighter in color and therefore not very high in rigor. So, we just wanted to highlight that to show that there's some potential work to be done in this area. I'm sure you're all curious in terms of the strategies that projects have used to achieve impacts, and in spite of the relative lack of evidence, there were a number of strategies that emerged across the different projects that we reviewed as effective in helping to improve job quality. So the first one was the importance of selecting the right sectors to work in. And some common criteria that were named by programs was to select sectors that had high growth potential, that were not already targeted by other programs, that had a certain level of product differentiation tied to the quality of work, which in turn was influenced by working condition, and of course the potential for participation by target groups. One example of a program that we thought applied these criteria quite well was Scope Indonesia, which worked in tofu processing, and specifically chose that sector because it was mid to low value, high volume, and had geographically close markets for basic commodities. It chose not to focus on high value markets because they felt then that only a few of the most advanced producers would benefit. Another strategy that we thought was quite effective was, well, as with market systems projects in general, the ones that were most effective in addressing job quality consistently worked at multiple levels of the system, that is at the individual, firm, and sector levels, and on both the demand side and supply side to improve job quality within the sector. So one example that we saw of this was the LEV program in Haiti, which is working, one of the sectors it's working in is the construction sector, and it's employing a variety of strategies at multiple levels to do this. It's building TVET capacity to offer demand-driven training and building connections between TVETs and the private sector. It's offering technical assistance and equipment to companies where there's a clear job creation rationale. It's working with the government to raise industry standards, which will in turn drive demand for skilled workers. And it also has plans to eventually work in facilitating financial and insurance markets that will support construction activities. A third strategy that we saw to be quite successful was building and communicating a business case for job quality, which Sebastien will talk more about in his presentation. Another program that we saw doing this quite well was ASIP Colombia, which had a large-scale workforce development program aimed at the country's ethnic minorities. And it found actually that companies who hired through its workforce development program benefited from significant cost savings and improved brand perception. So ASIP decided to invest in documenting and publicizing these benefits, which subsequently led to greater uptake of the model by the private sector. A fourth strategy that we commonly saw was MSD programs trying to work with government institutions to change the rules around decent work, both in their own recruitment and employment, but also to sort of compel the private sector to do so as well. One example of this was Ecovecindarios in Bolivia, which worked with the government to create Bolivia's first solid waste management law, which now requires companies to dispose of their waste through accredited operators. And this is now creating demand for such services for these operators, but also for related services such as accreditation institutes. Lastly, one other important strategy that emerged was building in the flexibility within log frames and budgets to modify the program design as needed. In other words, to manage adaptively. So ELI in Pakistan had as a key objective creating new types of paid employment for women in non-traditional sectors. But after some initial piloting and reflection, it decided actually to start with facilitating employment for women in actually more conventional jobs such as garments and home-based activities, which eventually made it easier for both men and women to accept women's paid employment outside the home.
Great. So following on those kind of concrete lessons or concrete examples of some of the programs that we looked at, we also extracted a number of lessons that we think are worth considering in moving forward and considering the role of a market systems development approach in terms of working conditions. The first one is really to simply consider job quality in program design. So many of the examples that we looked at were ones where job quality had not initially been part of the program design and had been brought in subsequently, often directly by the implementers, where they saw an opportunity or saw a way that they could actually fit in a job quality component, despite it not being part of the original design. And that's obviously reflected also in the fact that a lot of the measurement issues that Raksha raised are there, because actually job quality was not even part of the original measurement framework. A second one is to not consider, or assume rather, that higher income is always the #1 priority for target groups. It often is, but not consistently. And some of the examples we saw, for example, were ones where the distribution of income over the year was far more important than its aggregate value. In other cases, we saw that the investments that firms were making when it was interrogated as to the reasons why those were being made, these job quality investments, it actually was not primarily for the financial return, at least in terms of direct profitability, but other considerations such as employee retention or other kind of quality of life issues for the team. And so what that means is also, in terms of prioritization, Obviously, you know, with a framework like the ILOs, there are a lot of different aspects of working conditions, and it's really important to focus on the ones that make most sense within the context, rather than trying to tackle all of them or being unfocused in your approach. Another one is to look at being flexible in terms of your strategy. A lot of times the original sectors that have been selected did not prove to be particularly conducive for improvements in working conditions. They didn't fit some of the criteria that Raksha already mentioned. And so a lot of the programs that were most successful in this area, it was because they made mid-project course corrections around which strategies they were using and which sectors they were focused on. I think we're going to hear more about this right after I speak, but you know, communicating the business case is really important. A lot of times we think of working conditions as being really a race to the bottom, where firms keep to actually in terms of their lack of working conditions. But there were certainly cases we saw where kind of friendly competition within sectors created more of a race to the top in terms of trying to adopt certain criteria, and there being incentives and rewards, both monetary but also in terms of social rewards that came to that for the business owners. And then finally, the kind of, I think, key point coming out of that heat map was that there really hasn't been a lot of work done to date in measuring improvements in job quality or even including them within MRM systems. And such, that's a really fruitful area for additional focus for donors in the program design phase, and then for implementers while they're working on their programming. And so in terms of next steps, if you're interested, this is the report, and we'll share the link for that. And now we'll pass it over to Sebastien to give us more of a hands-on example from BIF Myanmar.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Sebastien. I'm based in Yangon, and I'm the team leader of the Business Innovation Facility in Myanmar. Just trying to put up my slides. Just a minute. Yeah. Oh, sorry, it's too fast. I can go back. Yeah. So the Business Innovation Facility is a 5.5-year DFID-funded facility that works in Malawi, Nigeria, and Myanmar, and has a global component as well that deals with multinationals directly from London. In Myanmar, or Burma, as some people still call it, we work in the garment sector, in the tourism sector, and in the bamboo sector. We started to work in the garment sector in 2013. At this time, there were about 200 factories, and the number of workers working in the sector was estimated at around 200,000. In 2016, there's about 400 factories, and the estimated number of workers is 400,000. So it's been a very rapid growth. In terms of export data, we went from around $500 million to $2.6 billion in 2006. So in 2016. Our vision for the garment sector is to increase the number of high-quality jobs for workers in an industry that understands and can demonstrate the link between better worker welfare and more successful business. So this facility, at least the work we do in the garment sector, is not about creating new jobs. It's about improving the quality of jobs. And I will come back to this one, because it's important. I know it's been mentioned before, but it's very important when it comes to managing expectations, amongst other things. Our garment strategy is articulated around 3 interventions really, and you can see on this diagram, factories are really core to these interventions. Factories, their managers, their owners, their supervisors, as well as obviously their workers, and also their suppliers and their buyers, that can play a really important role when it comes to the quality of the job and the demand they put on factories to improve worker welfare. Our first intervention is really about, which is intervention A, the light blue, is about demonstrating and disseminating the benefits of improved worker welfare and productivity. And we do that by creating basically the business case and in Myanmar there wasn't a lot of evidence about the link between productivity and welfare, and a lot of workers, when we started to work in this sector, we found were totally dehumanized. They were treated as almost like machine. Factory supervisors were yelling at them, hoping they would get more out of the production line, which is obviously not working. We've released the first iteration of the business case earlier this year. I'm working on another iteration now, and we've seen that this business case triggered demand for consultancy services in the garment sector. Unfortunately, there is no industrial engineering skills in Myanmar, so we had to build that from scratch, and that's very much intervention B, described in the dark blue box you see on the left. So these factory service providers basically deliver factory improvement services to factories. And the last intervention is about facilitating relationship between commercial players and stimulate the demand for services. In terms of intervention delivery, we've really started with intervention C by convening the first international meeting between Myanmar, the Myanmar garment industry, and the international brands, so M&S, H&M, Decathlon, Ralph Lauren, and the likes. That was in Hong Kong in 2014. And it's interesting that during this meeting, we find ourselves after 2 days of intense discussion in a bit of a deadlock where the Myanmar garment industry was camping on their position that the industry had child labor and they would not get rid of that because it was cultural in Myanmar, and the international brands on the other side were saying for us this is non-negotiable, so you got to solve this problem before we do business with you. And we find ourselves in a bit of a deadlock situation. Fortunately, a few months after, we convened another meeting where the Garment Manufacturer Association in Myanmar made a very strong statement condemning child labor in Myanmar and in garment factories. So that was a really good move. And since then we've seen the garment industry, the factory owners, and a number of people within the government as well taking a very strong stance on child labor and how this would hurt the reputation of the Myanmar industry. So potentially with this policy work we've done, we've influenced about 400 factories. If we go down to the intervention A area, the demonstrating the business case, demonstrating and disseminating the business case, we can now prove with the randomized control trial we've done with Tufts University, that we've directly improved the welfare of about 7,700 workers in 13 factories. Now, if we move to intervention B, so that's the cycle of both, we can see that the factory service providers we've worked with and we've trained over the past year through a training of trainer, as well as the technical assistance we've used for improving working conditions in some of the factories of intervention A. We were able with that to reach 19 factories, and that's very much our expansion strategy, using the TAs we've worked with, as well as the factory service providers we've trained to reach out to more factories and to make working conditions more widely acknowledged as a source of potential for improving productivity, along with obviously improving productivity methods and introducing HR systems and processes in order to reduce absenteeism, turnover, increase length of service, and so on and so forth. The key performance indicator we use are fairly straightforward. You will see 4 boxes here. We've got KPIs for productivity, human resources, and profitability. The worker welfare indicator are the take-home pay, the job satisfaction, and the well-being of the workers. As was shown in the market associate slides, there are several areas you can consider when it comes to measuring worker welfare and worker well-being. So we decided only to focus on these 3 key indicators, and that's already quite difficult to measure, considering the external factors that are part of the normal evolution of any kind of industry. And in Myanmar, the most significant shock was the introduction, for us in terms of impact measurement, was the introduction of the minimum wage in September 2015. Myanmar is the 2nd lowest minimum wage in the region after Bangladesh these days. So yeah, you also need to take into account these shocks, and even if we have a very powerful and neat monitoring system with the randomized control trial, it's still challenging to isolate the effect of the minimum wage, but we're working on it. Some learning points I wanted to share with you. I think that's probably one of the most interesting slides. The minimum wage I've just talked about. The sensitivity of job quality to shocks is also very important. So if that can be a natural disaster, conflict, introduction of minimum wage, strikes, embargoes or quotas in Myanmar, the introduction of the global system of preference for exporting to the European Union was a very important trigger in order to move the sector forward. But again, it has to be taken into account in the job quality. In this case, it was a positive effect. Capturing job quality data through expansion is also an interesting one. If you remember the 3 cycles I've shown in the diagram, the further you move away from your direct intervention, the more difficult it is to attribute the change to the facility, and the more difficult it is to actually measure the transformation and the improvement in the job quality. Then another one is the capacity and interest of the scale agents to capture job quality. If you train factory service providers to improve productivity, they're interested in making sure the client is happy, and not necessarily measuring the job quality, although we try to push them for that. Some of them are not yet quite at the stage where they can promote inclusive businesses as part of the business model. And then finally, the role of the management association and the buyers is also very important in improving the job quality. So we have to remember we work in an ecosystem that is used to use standard certifications and so on and so forth. Then the last lesson, and then a question perhaps, is often there are some expectations on the donor side that any private sector development project will necessarily have an employment effect, and that's not always the case. And in our case, trying to get the message across that this is not about job creation. is not necessarily easy. So we have to find creative ways of measuring, employment effects. And in this case, I'm using the elasticity of the and the last question is, can a business, can a standalone business case approach improve the job quality? And that's that's a question I think for all of us to answer. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ben and Raksha and Sebastien for providing such good insights and overview of, one, the research, and then two, a very practical case there. I see that we either have a shy audience or perhaps a little bit overwhelmed of an audience at the moment. So again, put some questions in the chat box here if you've got them. But as I don't have any and I have the mic, I will ask a couple myself here. And the first one is for Ben and Raksha and the research. And you mentioned something about programs that don't necessarily start out with a focus on job quality or addressing decent work, sometimes make course corrections to re-strategize and address decent work. I don't know if you have any experiences in the research that you found might be sort of important corrections that projects could make to, if they're sort of not addressing job quality already, and could pivot to that in the future. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And then a question for Sebastien is how how will the direct BIF intervention or support for a small number of factories benefiting just a small percentage of garment workers lead to a larger systemic change in the industry? So maybe I will push that to Ben and Raksha to start out, and then after that, then Sebastien maybe can answer the second question, if that's okay.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that's a great question. And what we found in terms of market systems programs that didn't initially start off with the focus on job quality, but shifted to do so, is, we found that was actually quite common with programs that had a second phase of funding and programming. And in the first phase, they had tended to focus on sort of the more traditional aspects of job creation, job quality, so improving incomes, improving access to jobs. But a number of the programs that we talked to that were entering their second or even third phase, such as Eco-Vecindarios, Ili Pakistan, market makers, they really saw that in order to have sustained impacts for the populations that they were trying to work with, it wasn't just enough to create jobs, but it was also really important to ensure that the quality of jobs that they were creating or helping them access was also improving. And this was especially the case for, I'll cite Eco-Vecindarios because they were working in the waste management sector, and many of the people they were working with were, quite vulnerable groups, informal waste pickers. So it wasn't just enough to make sure that they had sort of regular income, but also to help them improve the conditions within which they were working. Another example that comes to mind is Ili Pakistan. They found that even though they were facilitating women's access to employment, as the program continued, they found sort of mixed results in terms of what this actually meant for women, because they had now access to jobs, more access to income, but this also meant more time away from home. And of course, with the unpaid care burdens that women often have, this could be problematic. And so they kind of had to assess and shift their strategy around that. And I know one of the strategies that they employed was actually to help create new childcare facilities for women who had now started working outside the home. So a couple examples there that hopefully answer your question.
Great, thanks very much for that, Raksha. Sebastien, would you be able to answer the question on sort of a number of, well, support for a small number of factories and workers transforming to larger systemic change.
That's right. So the work we've done with the first group of factories was really to get a proof of concept and to develop a body of evidence that will enable us basically to create this business case. Now the business case is a multi-dimensional, multifaceted animal, if you want. It's got obviously the context and why it's relevant to the context, and it's got a component that the strategic fit, the problems you're trying to resolve, the scope, the evaluation criteria you use, the possible options, as well as a very important element for the businesses, which is cost-benefit analysis. So we're now at the stage where we've got most of the data for that, and it's now a matter of using this business case and putting it into various formats and support to reach out to the scale agents really. That includes the government, the business association, the Apex association, the local consulting firm, as well as the international consulting company working in the garment sector or working on some specific aspect of productivity, such as the Lean method, the Kaizen methods, and it's about reaching out to the larger, basically to the larger, to the whole of the industry, to make them aware that there are solutions out there for them to improve their productivity and to improve the worker welfare, thereby reducing their turnover and also reducing, the absenteeism in their factories. So developing a win-win business model, a bit more inclusive, is what we're trying to achieve. So how does that lead to expansion through a series of interventions? I was saying a bit earlier, can business case on its own, trigger a market system change? I don't think so. I think it needs much more than that, and we should not be thinking that just by creating a business case and disseminating this business case, changes will happen, because most businesses are often very happy with the status quo. And so it requires support for the second movers or the followers, if you want, and that support is not as intense as what we provide for the first movers, but it's quite significant as well.
That's great. No, thanks for that explanation there. I think we have we're finally getting a wave of questions here, and there's a couple that I will actually pose both to Ben and Raksha and Sebastien. And I think there's a question about the tension of, can you improve both job quality, in a way that's good for business? I mean, Sebastien, you seem to make the business case there in BIF Myanmar, but are you doing that at the sacrifice at creating new jobs, or can you invest in both worker quality and improve worker productivity, for example, but then not necessarily reduce the number of jobs because of, say, productivity increases, or the level of investment that you have to put into your workers is now higher? I don't know if either or both of you could speak to that, but
I can speak to that. I think improving the number of, improving the job quality makes your factory more reputable and increase the number of orders you're likely to receive, and so also increase your reputation, so you're likely to attract more and better workers. I think I think if you can improve the job quality and create more jobs in a certain place, because if you're known for treating your workers well, then you're likely to receive orders from more better reputable brands. I think what in the garment sector, the biggest threat to the number of jobs that are being created is probably automation more than anything else.
Yeah, Steve, I would just follow up with that to say that I think, as Sebastien noted, BIF Myanmar, and there are other cases as well that demonstrate where you can find those cases that investment in working condition improvements actually do also help the bottom line. Those aren't universal, obviously, and some of the research that does exist, done by the ILO and others, does suggest that there are certainly differences that influence when those kind of win-win situations occur, based on things like business size, the sector, what are the initial state of the working conditions before investments are made, and so on. But certainly there are lots of examples where there is that correlation, and often that correlation happens via productivity, so that investments in working conditions improve company productivity, and hence pay for the improvements that have been made.
Great. Thanks for that. Good to see a number of questions coming in here. So the next question I have is for Ben and Raksha on the research there, and it's when you're looking across the different projects, did you identify any sort of practical difference? I know you were just talking a minute ago, Ben, about the sort of nuances between kind of addressing job quality and the impact on business throughout sector and maybe informal and formal and sort of size. But do you find anything in terms of anything we can sink our teeth into about the practical differences of approaches in sort of formal and informal employment?
So if we understood the question correctly, Steve, you're saying what were some of the differences that different approaches that projects trialed in working with businesses in the formal sector versus informal sector? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. What we found actually was, unfortunately, many market systems development programs were either reluctant or prevented from working with businesses in the informal sector, even though they recognized that this is where a lot of jobs in developing economies are, and this is also where there was a lot of work to be done in terms of improving working conditions. And the reason that they couldn't really work in those sectors is, one reason was donor rules that sort of compelled them to work only with registered businesses that could be held accountable to legislation. Another reason I think that programs preferred to work with formal businesses is because they already had some sort of reporting system in place that the project could sort of draw upon and build on. And so there was really a small handful of programs that even attempted to work with informal businesses, and even when they did, the main approach that they took was to help them formalize the business by getting the business registered, getting contracts for workers, which we would assume that there were some benefits that would come from that. At the same time, the prospect of formalizing businesses in context of high bureaucracy and high taxes is not necessarily a positive one. Many programs said that businesses didn't want to formalize because, there was just like no benefits to them for doing so. So, we can't, all of that to say, in this research, we weren't able to meet a lot of market systems programs that did work with that did a lot of work with informal businesses or workers. There were a couple, but I don't think enough to sort of draw inferences from. So I think what that said to us was that there was perhaps a need for more flexibility from donors and from programs in terms of approaching these sectors and working with them. And also I think another concern in working with these businesses was, you know, building their accountability, or building their capacity to report on their results. And so that's something perhaps to take into account in designing the programs as well, if you are in fact going to work with informal sector businesses.
Great, super interesting, and yeah, it's always a challenge for I think anyone in any project is to how to deal with the informal sector, but something we're grappling with ourselves. So I'll switch over to Sebastien and lob a couple of questions over to you, and there's two, and one is from Annette Anderson, who says, would improvement in decent work alone be sufficient for improving efficiency and productivity? Or have you tested for other factors as well, and maybe what those might be? The other one is you've talked about the RCT around the business case for better working conditions, and this question comes in from Biljana, who was asking, is there an example that maybe we can reference showing this business case, as if Myanmar put something into public domain that we can reference? I think that would be useful for a lot of people.
Yeah, perhaps starting with the RCT question. So the RCT is essentially three different phases: the baseline, the midline, and the end line. And what we produced at the midline is the first iteration of the business case. That was very much based on our learning and less so on the hard data coming out from the analysis of the randomized controlled trial. So I believe this is available on our website, bidprogram.org, and if it's not, I'll make sure it's uploaded in the next few days, so we can make this available. The next iteration of the business case I'm working on is going to be much more comprehensive, and we'll have a number of elements I spoke about earlier on. There's going to be a third iteration and maybe a fourth and fifth in 2018. So I'm very happy to keep this group posted and to post that on the BMXChange website or on the CE website, whatever is the most appropriate, but it will also be made available on our website, bidprogram.org. Yes. So on the second question, is improving worker welfare, is sufficient? Unfortunately, no, it's not, because it's not a very compelling case for businesses to accept to pay consultants or trainers to go in their factory to give more rights and empower their workers. They don't really see the interest. So what we found is that it's always good to to provide a package whereby you will include some productivity elements that will generate cost saving that will then be redistributed between the management or the shareholders and the workforce. So improving worker welfare alone through social dialogue or better HR facilities or HR policies is likely to is going to have a benefit impact, a positive impact, but for the factory owner, I guess it's always more compelling to have this kind of package. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, for me it certainly did, and I think at this stage, yeah, we are. So there's one request, if Sebastien, you could write the website name maybe in the chat box, if you've that you just referenced. Maybe if you could write the website name to everyone so that they have link to what we were just talking about.
Yeah. Perhaps just to add very quickly on this point, I think we spoke about factories and as well as some other sectors, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that every single business is different and it's not black and white. You will have factory owners that are concerned with their turnover. Some will be concerned with their absenteeism. Some will be concerned with their productivity. And I think this is for us. It's one of the tricks, to find the right entry point and to be able to adapt your pitch, or at least for the factory service providers we work with. It's been a challenge for them to basically cope with and adapt to the demand of the different factory owners. And I think this is where it goes back to your having a very agile sales and marketing team in your as part of the service providers you support is important.
Great, thanks for that extra explanation and sort of indicating how nuanced, how nuanced dealing with individual businesses can be, particularly when you're looking at working conditions and business performance. I think that's we're at our time limit now, and so I wanted to say thank you for all the participants. I've posted just recently links to the research from Ben and Raksha, a link to our own website in case you're interested to find out more about market systems and decent work. It seems that I'll pass the mic now over to Mike Albu, who might say some closing remarks here. But just wanted to say a special thanks to all our speakers today and all the participants and the great questions and engagement. So thank you very much.
Yes, well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, of course, Raksha and Ben and Sebastien for your very eloquent presentations. Thank you to everyone who came along and posted questions. There are a few links in the chat box. Please do follow them up if you want to find out more about this report, about the work of the ILO lab, or about the work of the Business Innovation. I would really love you all to click on. It will take you about 15-20 seconds to complete our short survey form. It's the Google Forms link that was posted a few minutes ago by DCD. Please do by clicking on that link and spending 10 seconds to give us your feedback on what you liked or didn't like about this webinar. And please keep coming back to the Beam webinar page where you'll find information about, of course, recordings of this webinar and all other webinars that we've had in the past 2 years, and information about upcoming webinars that might be of interest. But otherwise, have a great day, and thank you very much to everyone for participating.